Okay, as we continue with the rise of Christianity, we want to go to this map I showed in an earlier session about where the Jewish community was in the first century. So if we look over here, again, pointing out that the majority of the Jews were in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, so very large communities here in Palestine, Turkey, Egypt, parts of Greece, and then also here in the Babylonian area. But then as we move forward with the growth of Christianity, what we want to look at, particularly in this next slide, is where these communities first grew. And so I think you'll see an interesting pattern. So right here in the green is Christian expansion by the year 200. So notice where it is. We've got them here in the Palestine-Syria area. We've got them here in the areas over here in Turkey. Let me see. I think I might have missed one slide. I might have jumped forward. Nope, didn't. Okay. There it is. All right. So anyway, in Turkey, southern and western Turkey, parts of Greece, parts of Egypt, and so on. And obviously, what it shows here is that the growth of early Christianity occurred in the Jewish areas, because you had large numbers of Jewish people coming to faith, and then you also had larger numbers of Gentiles who were coming to faith as well, but they were associated with the Jewish community. What we saw from the book of Acts is that there were God-fearers who were coming to faith because they had already entertained that there was one God, that paganism was not acceptable, but they were already in a second-class status, and so the gospel elevated them to a first-class status without becoming Jews. And so these are the people who are going to be most receptive to the gospel, and you can see, like I said, from the map up here, that's exactly what happens, is that these groups are the ones who respond most favorably to the gospel. And then, as the century goes on, the expansion goes of Christianity. The 200 to 300 era is like all in the Egyptian area, which were huge Jewish communities all along in here. And then it begins to expand outward, out beyond it. I mean, there were some Jewish communities out here, but not as much. Southern Spain, there were Jewish communities, and that grew in there as well. But then as you grow up into France and parts of Italy and then the Balkans, the Jewish communities are much smaller, and you're getting much larger expansion into Gentile areas. And then, of course, as we move even a little further forward, you see now, especially with the Roman Empire being Christianized by decree, so large parts of the Roman Empire are already Christian, and then really by the 400s, 500s, the entire empire is Christianized, but again, it's a little hard to know how much of this was really genuine and how much of this was simply a result of being kind of grandfathered in by the various decrees. So that just shows the early growth, and like we said in the last session, we began to see at the turn of the first century the change in attitudes towards the Christian community, towards the Jewish community, the early believers, that it was there was a dramatic shift of saying, we're no longer consider ourselves Jews or anything part of the Jewish community, and that ultimately leads to pretty serious Christian anti-Semitism. So we want to begin with what I would consider to be one of the most important. It could be the most important of all the church fathers. He would be the person I would call the father of Christian theology, which is Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr did his writings from the 130s to the 150s, and his two greatest works were known as the first and second apologies. And what I mean by apologies, he's not apologizing for anything, but apologies is another word for the defense of one's faith. So he was giving the reasons why the Christian faith is the superior faith. And the two groups to which he was competing was Greek philosophy and paganism, which was largely embraced by the Roman Empire, and by the Jewish faith. So in his arguments, he's arguing against these other faiths, showing the superiority of the Christian faith. And it's in these arguments that he basically says for the first time that the church is the true Israel, is the true spiritual Israel. And he's the one who really introduces the concept of what later comes known as replacement theology. The idea that the church has replaced the Jewish people in God's purposes and God's economy, and all the promises that were originally intended for Israel and the Jewish people have now been transferred to the church, and the Jewish people no longer have a role in God's economy. He's the one that really began this. Now, where he fleshes this out is in another book that he wrote, which is called The Dialogue with Trypho the Jew. And the story goes, and it's unclear as to whether this actually happened, but supposedly it was in the 140s, and he is in the area of Ephesus, which would have been the southern part of what today would be Turkey. He was getting ready to sail on a ship to someplace, and as he's waiting a few days, this man by the name of Trypho, a Jewish person with a few other folks, a few other Jews, have come into, are also going to sail and have been fleeing from the result of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which had occurred years earlier. And so they get into this lengthy discussion about Judaism versus Christianity. And it's through this discussion that some really alarming things are said. I mean, first of all, Trypho is criticizing Justin for believing that Jesus is really the Messiah because he said he's not, and the prophecies don't point to him. And Justin, of course, responds that they definitely do. And so they kind of go back and forth, and that's perfectly fine. But Justin outlines in this dialogue with him what he considers to be the 4 important episodes in all of world history. And these 4 episodes, which I'm going to mention right now, is the absolute basis of Christian theology, and it is universally accepted in Christianity today, right across the board. And we'll see fairly quickly that there's some serious problems with this idea. But first of all, this is what he says: the 4 important episodes in world history. The first episode is the creation, where God created all things for good and for his purposes. So that's the first event. The second event is the fall of mankind through Adam and Eve, and thus it threw man into this kind of depraved state, separated from God. The third episode of importance is redemption in Christ, as introduced in the New Testament. And then the fourth important episode is the consummation of all things, when Christ returns on this earth and establishes his kingdom over the entire earth. And so that's how he frames the world and world history, the important episodes in world history. Again, I want to emphasize Christian theology across the board accepts these as the key events in all of world history. But for those of us who are taking this course, we're going to immediately see that there's some major problems with this idea. Because really, here's the way it would be broken down scripturally. Genesis 1 Genesis 1 through 2 is the creation. Genesis 3 is the fall of mankind. And then Matthew begins with the redemption of Christ. So the question is, what about the rest of the scriptures? What about Genesis 4 all the way through the rest of the Hebrew Bible? I mean, does it have any purpose whatsoever? Now, Justin Martyr would say yes. There is parts of it that do have some relevance. And what he said is he broke the Hebrew Bible into 3 parts. And now we also have to understand, when he wrote, the New Testament was not yet canonized. So there was no true New Testament at that point. I mean, there were the letters of Paul circulating, the Gospels were circulating, but there was nothing accepted as authoritative text. So the only Bible was the Hebrew Bible. And he said that there's 3 important three ways of looking at three significant sections to the Hebrew Bible. Number 1, there's value in the prophecies that point to the coming of Christ. Number 2, there's sections that only were given to the Jews for their hardness of their heart. And number 3, there's parts of it that are universal and binding on all people. That would be like the ethical and moral sections of the Jewish scriptures. But insofar as Israel and the Jewish people having any role in God's plan, it has nothing to do with Justin Martyr's theology. It's irrelevant as far as he was concerned. And this is what he says, and I'm going to be quoting him in response to Trypho the Jew regarding the issue of circumcision. And this is what he says. The purpose of circumcision is the following, quote, "So that you and you only might suffer the afflictions due to those who crucified Christ. Since circumcision of the flesh is the only mark by which you can certainly be distinguished from other men. So in other words, circumcision was originally instituted by the Lord to designate who his people were, his chosen people were, the Jewish people. Now, according to Justin Martyr, circumcision's purpose is the reverse. It's to designate the people who have rejected God and have rejected Christ. It's the mark of the curse rather than a mark of the blessing. And so this becomes the foundation of early Christian theology, and everything that happens thereafter is built upon Justin Martyr's teachings. So we have to understand that he starts a certain track in his theological orientation, and it just gets built upon and, quite frankly, gets worse over time. The next person that we want to look at is a man by the name of Marcion, who lived right around the year 200. Now, Marcion is one of the great church fathers, but he becomes heretical in his views, and he's eventually excommunicated from the church because he adopts a Gnostic approach towards Christianity. Now, Gnosticism was a philosophy, Greek philosophy, that was current at that time, that had been for the last few hundred years. It was a concept of what's called a dualistic philosophy. In other words, that there was the spiritual world, and then there was the natural world, and that the two were separated, that the spiritual was much higher than the natural world, and that things like philosophy and religion were a part of the spiritual world, but then things like the body and the flesh and so forth, those were part of the material world, and they were far lower and inferior. So Marcion takes this Gnostic philosophy and integrates it with Christianity, so that he comes up with this theory that there's actually two gods. There's the God of the Old Testament, and then there's the God of the New Testament. And that the God of the New Testament is greater than the God of the Old Testament, because the God of the Old pertains to that which is of the material, and the God of the New pertains to that which is the spiritual. And Jesus rescues us from the material and the Jews, who are part of that material world. That's how Marcion understands things. Now, there's two folks who respond to Marcion from the more Orthodox Christian church, two very well-known church fathers. The first one is a man by the name of Tertullian. And one of the difficulties is how to explain the unity of the Scriptures. In other words, you have the Hebrew Bible going in one direction, and then you have the New Testament writings, again, not canonized, but by the year 200, pretty well established. You have these writings apparently going in another direction, or seemingly so. So he's got to explain how the Scriptures are really united, because Marcion explained it by saying there's two gods, and that's how it's resolved. So Tertullian says this. He says that the God of Jesus Christ is the same as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There is no other God, there's only one God. Okay, so that part, that's great. Then what he says next is not so great. Quoting him, he says, the commandments of the Torah are degrading and unworthy of an enlightened people. It was given to the Jews to curb idolatry and greed, which was unique to them, not shared by the rest of the human race. Their trail of crimes culminated in the killing of Christ. Jews were always unworthy of election, and now they lost it. God's choice has now been transferred to the Gentiles, who are capable of living at a higher level than the Jewish people. Now that's odd, because first of all, he says that idolatry and greed was unique to the Jewish people. But when you read the Hebrew Scriptures, they were supposed to be the unique people, the people that were separate from the rest of the idolatrous nations. And they lived at a much higher level than the Gentiles around them. They were to be the light to the nations. That was the idea here. So, in other words, he's completely twisting it. But the most important thing here is he's saying that God's election has now been removed from the Jews. It's been transferred to the Gentile people. And so God's purposes, which was to use the Jews as a light to the nations, and Yeshua, as we talked about in earlier sessions, enables the Jewish community, the Jewish world in Israel to fulfill her destiny to be a light, is completely rejected, and now it's transferred over to a completely another group. Then Irenaeus, who is a contemporary of Tertullian, another great church father, also responds to the Marcion heresy, He tackles it a little differently. He tries to show that the theme of God's history, which began at the creation, continues kind of on an unending stream through the redemption of Christ, all the way to the consummation when God will bring about his kingdom on the earth. So rather than trying to kind of bifurcate the testaments and saying one is different from the other, he shows that there's one kind of unyielding stream, which is probably a good, I think it's a good analysis. But then again, he got to focus on the Jews. And so this is what he says about the Jewish people. Quoting him, he said, God chose the Jews in order to prepare them for Christ, but they rejected him and murdered him. And because the Jews rejected him, God granted their inheritance to the Gentiles alone. Jews who boast of being Israel are disinherited from the grace of God. They are no longer useful. Wow. So now the Jews are no longer useful. So what does that mean? If they're not useful, that means you can pretty much do anything you want with them, and it's perfectly fine with God. And so that's what we see in later writings. Now we move forward a little further into other church writings. We come to Eusebius, who is a great church historian, used even to this day in most church histories, because he writes the history of the church from the times of Yeshua or the apostles to the year 300, which is when he was writing. And some of the stuff in there, especially with respect to the Jewish Christian community, the Messianic community, is actually quite useful because he identifies that there are still, the Nazarene community still exists up to the time that he's writing. In fact, they're quite sizable in his view. And they exist in places like Palestine, Syria, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia, which is in the Babylonian area. But he sees that Judaism itself has no merit and is a threat to the church. And what he does is he then amplifies old Greek anti-Semitic myths against the Jewish people and brings them into Christianity by claiming that Jews on Purim crucify Christians to show their rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. Old Greek myths used to accuse Jews of crucifying Greeks or Romans during that period, during various holidays, and it was a way of it's kind of known as the ritual murder charge, which is later picked up by the church in the Middle Ages. But this kind of what should I say? It codifies this anti-Semitic tirade against Jews, this myth, into early church history, which is then elaborated upon by the priests later on in medieval Christianity, which we'll get to. And so becomes quite tragic and actually leads to hundreds of thousands of Jewish deaths at the hands of so-called Christians because of this particular charge that's laid against them. Around the same time, early 300s, there still is a concern about Jewish influence in the early church, and so there was a series of things that were written. There's something known as the apostolic canons that said that if a clergyman entered into a synagogue of the Jews or into the heretics, which would be the Messianic Jewish community, the Nazarenes, to pray, that he would be deposed. And if a layman did so, he would be excommunicated. So you can see immediately that there's not only a complete separation from the Jewish world, but also separation from the Messianic Jewish world. They didn't want to have anything to do with them, and they considered them to be complete heretics. Then you have the question of what happens if a Jewish person becomes a believer in Christ. In other words, what do you do with him? Well, because Judaism was so hated that you had to ensure that this Jewish convert would be completely separated and would renounce every aspect of any Jewish heritage. So what I'm going to read next is what a Jew had to say to become a Christian under the tutelage, under the umbrella of the Church of Constantinople, which was the most influential church in the 4th century in the Eastern Empire. And so this is what he had to say, quoting from these confessions. A Jew who converts to Christianity. I confess and denounce verbally the whole Hebrew people and forthwith declare that with a whole heart and sincere faith he desires to be received among the Christians. He must renounce openly in the church all Jewish superstition, saying, I renounce all customs, rites, legalisms, unleavened breads, and sacrifice of lambs of the Hebrews, and all the other feasts of the Hebrews, sacrifices, prayers, aspersions, purifications, sanctifications, and propitiations and fasts, and new moons and Sabbaths and superstitions, and hymns and chants and observances, and synagogues and the food and drink of the Hebrews. In one word, I renounce absolutely everything Jewish. At the same time, another series of renunciations in the Eastern Empire for a Jew to become a Christian. I renounce the whole worship of the Hebrews, circumcision, all its legalisms, unleavened bread, Passover, the sacrificing of lambs, the Feast of Weeks, Jubilees, trumpets, atonement, tabernacles, and all the other Hebrew feasts, their sacrifices, prayers, aspersions, purifications, expiations, fasts, Sabbaths, new moons, food and drinks. And I absolutely renounce every custom and institution of the Jewish laws. Wow. Okay, talking about not accepting Messianic Judaism at any level. That is clearly the case. Very tragic, but you see the complete separation of Judaism and the Jewish people from the church. The church is completely now has nothing to do with Jews except it sees them as enemies. And anybody that comes to faith in Christ has to renounce everything Jewish. I mean, so that makes it abundantly clear. And then we come to the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, really probably considered to be the most important of all the church councils. This is the primary purpose of this church council was to deal with the controversy known as Arianism. And Arianism was a fairly significant sect of Christianity that did not consider Jesus to be divine. In other words, that he was only a human. He died on the cross and for our sins and everything, but he was not divine. And so they had to address this issue, but in so doing, they further disassociated Christianity from Judaism. They decided that Easter would no longer be linked to Passover at all. And in doing this, the Nicene fathers said the following, quote, "For it is unbecoming beyond measure that on this holiest of festivals we should follow the customs of the Jews. Henceforth, let us have nothing in common with this odious people." So this is really kind of this is like a formal separation between Judaism and Christianity at this particular point, and so that really they go on their separate ways. Now we come to next, things get increasingly difficult. What we've seen is the foundation has been laid for a virulent Christian anti-Semitism. In other words, Christianity has nothing to do with Judaism. Christianity has replaced Judaism. The Christians have replaced the Jewish people. And now it lends itself to the next step of the mistreatment of Jewish people by Christian leaders. And that's what we see in the preachings by a man by the name of John Chrysostom. John is considered to be the father of the Orthodox Church. That's the father of like the Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and all the churches of the Eastern Empire. He was the bishop of Constantinople. He was known as the bishop with the golden tongue. He was a phenomenal orator. And he issued 6 sermons against the Jews and their beliefs, primarily because of their influence in the Eastern Church and so on. And this is what he says. He says, "The Jews are the most worthless of all men. They are lecherous, greedy, and rapacious. They are perfidious murderers of Christ. They worship the devil. Their religion is a sickness. The Jews are the odious assassins of Christ. And for killing God, there is no expiation possible, no indulgence or pardon. Christians may never cease vengeance, and the Jews must live in servitude forever. God always hated the Jews. It is incumbent upon all Christians to hate the Jews." Wow. I mean, if you've never heard that before, that is a shocker. We're not talking about an illiterate. We're not talking about a pagan. We're talking about a well-established, leading Christian, the father of the entire Orthodox Church. This is what he's considered. And he says these amazing things. You wonder if the guy ever read the Bible. I mean, it's really tragic. And what we're going to see here in our next session is let's compare what John Chrysostom says to the writings of Paul. I mean, it's as if he ignored it completely. A real tragedy, but he sets a new course that leads to horrible consequences for the Jewish community. And we're going to begin to cover that in our next session.